Hello all. So I'm going to be talking about anthropomorphism in science songs. When we anthropomorphize, we are attributing human characteristics to non-human things. And I'm also going to be talking about a related concept of teleology, which is when we apply goals and intentions to things that don't have goals or intentions. So as I'm going through this, this is something I do and I think about a lot because evolutionary biology is rife with a lot of errors that relate to teleology and anthropomorphism. And so I do think about it, but I also write a lot of songs that use it. So this is kind of my presentation about how I feel about anthropomorphism. Okay, so I'm going to start out by singing a song. So this song is, the central metaphor here is that electrons are in relationships with the various molecules that they are associated with during photosynthesis. So I believe we were asking before about whether the world needs one more photosynthesis song. Well, this is another photosynthesis song. If I were teaching this song, I would typically teach it after having talked about the light reactions, right? So it would be sort of a review. And one of the things I really want to get across is this idea of electronegativity, that various molecules are lower energy when they're associated with electrons than other molecules. Okay. There are two photosystems that catch light from the sun, and they beam the ruin of many electrons for energy undone. I had been safe in water, then I tore that home apart to bind reaction centers stably till I broke those pigments' hearts. 'Cause the photons lift electrons, their excitement passed to me. I left the one who loved me stably, an acceptor accepted me. Oh, atoms tell electrons not to do what I have done. If you must reduce a molecule, choose an electronegative one. Well, I soon left that acceptor as my energy was drained. Pass from carrier to carrier molecule down electron transport chain. Well, the second photosystem they call photosystem 1. It's so briefly the home of this poor electron till the rising of the sun. All right, so that's an example of a song, and as you can see, it quite heavily uses anthropomorphism, right? The electron is portrayed as, essentially a human with human emotions towards what is in fact just a series of chemical reactions. So here's the thing about anthropomorphism, right? The advantage to anthropomorphism is that it's powerful because people are fascinated by people. People understand motivation and goals easily, right? When we think in the context of motivation and goals, I think we understand things very easily. We understand at an intuitive level that we don't necessarily understand, how molecules are actually behaving. And what anthropomorphism does is it maps all this stuff onto abstract concepts. right? So this is from a study in 1998. They taught some high school students using a textbook that had a lot of anthropomorphism in it. And these are some statements that some of the students made at the end when they were asked sort of about how they felt about it. It's obvious that plants do not really try or wish. However, using such expressions makes it easier to understand. We're old enough to know that the plant has no brain and hence no wishes. However, it is more convenient to communicate using these expressions. And in this particular study, it was found that there was no difference in learning, and in fact, no difference in errors related to anthropomorphism between the students who had been exposed to this other textbook and sort of a control group of similar students that had not been exposed in such a way. So that's like the good side, right? But the flip side is it's dangerous. Anthropomorphism is a little dangerous, right? Because it's not true. As scientists and as educators, we want to teach our students stuff that's true. And it's simply not true that an electron has any sort of feelings whatsoever about what molecule it's associated with. It can be misleading. So there's another study that it exposed, this was 5 to 12-year-olds, it exposed them to narratives that either used anthropomorphism or need-based explanations or sort of more accurate explanations about evolution. And so, anthropomorphism would be something like you're actually saying the animal wants to do something, right? And then needs-based would be the animal needs to do something. None of that is as accurate as animals do things because there has in the past been an advantage to organisms that carry genes that made those attributes advantageous. I made a circle myself around, but you see how many words I need to say what's really going on, right? But this can cause confusion in students, right? And in this other study, students who have been exposed to these anthropomorphizing sources, they made more mistakes, specifically about teleology, right? So they thought things that weren't true about what's really going on. So in addition to being misleading, it's also seductive, right? So in this other study, people were exposed to these various statements, like germs mutate in order to become antibiotic resistant. The Earth has an ozone layer in order to protect it from UV light. So these statements, if not directly anthropomorphic, are 100% teleological, right? They're applying intentions and goals to things that don't have them. This isn't what happens. Germs don't mutate in order to become antibiotic resistant. It is true that certain mutations increase antibiotic resistance, and those tend to increase in the population due to natural selection, right? So it turns out that a bunch of college students were asked about this, and as you can see, if we look at this graph, we have a mean percentage of test sentences, which were sentences like the ones on the left here, endorsed, and quite a few of these college students accepted these, which is one thing, but then also they asked the same questions of some physical scientists, and a fair number of these physical scientists also agreed with this. Incidentally, the speeded versus unspeeded, that is whether they were given a sort of limited amount of time to answer the questions, and unsurprisingly, when given a limited amount of time, scientists as well as college students relied more on these sort of mental shortcuts that we're used to making. And it's very likely that scientists could have answered these questions better, right? If they were really thinking about this distinction, they probably could have made it, and they probably didn't actually misunderstand what's going on here. But they still use a simplifying language. And I've encountered this myself. I went to the evolution meetings a couple years ago when I was really thinking about this, and I counted up sort of how many evolutionary biologists said wanted about organisms that weren't really wanting anything. And it was a lot. People use these as shortcuts, and it's very easy to end up doing that, even when you aren't necessarily thinking about the fact that you're doing it. Okay, so that's a danger, but is it worth it? I mean, I say yes. I write a lot of songs that use anthropomorphism, and that's just because it's so sticky, right? So, DNA is not the instruction manual for the cell, right? That's not what's going on. I mean, it does have a lot of information that is used by the cell, but it's not an instruction manual in that sort of sense. It's in a teleological sense. And yet it's what, pretty much all, I think most high school students get exposed to that idea at one point or another. And that's because it's a useful idea. It's an idea that gets across the big picture very quickly. Now, are there dangers to that? I think there can be, but it's just so sticky that I think it's worth it. And in addition, this is just another study at the bottom here that showed that anthropomorphism increased retention of some ideas. But then the other thing is that because anthropomorphism is so incredibly sticky, I think that if you sing these songs or you present this material with anthropomorphism in the proper way, you actually can help inoculate against misconceptions, because so many of students' misconceptions have to do with anthropomorphism and teleology. And if we can kind of understand that, if we can teach students to understand that, if we can teach students to be on the lookout for that, I think that's better than not exposing them to anthropomorphism at all. So here's here's the really big caveat to this, which is you need to provide the context, right? So I talk to my students all the time about how, electrons don't want anything. Evolution does not make organisms have the things that they want to have, right? If you don't provide that context, I think it's rather dangerous to use anthropomorphism. But I think if you do, it can be worthwhile. And this song here, this next song I'm about to sing, is a example of a song that I wrote explicitly to combat anthropomorphic or teleological errors about what evolution is. Because students think that evolution, they imagine that picture of, you got the monkey, then the chimpanzee, then early Australopithecine or whatever, and then Homo sapiens, and they think that's how evolution works, right? They think it's this sort of process that has led sort of inevitably to us. And so I sing this song kind of as a corrective to that. And it's to the tune of Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time. Genes slip through generations blindly in search of you, shaping and shaped by your ancestors that they flowed through, each birth changing, gained or cast aside. The past hides inside of us, change over. Oh wait, no, that's a different version. Sorry, I cut this down. Change over, no planning needed, just selection and a little chance. All of your parents lived long enough to find romance. Genes evolved to make us. They never knew. They never needed to. They don't think, they don't want, they don't understand. Change over time, but they urgently replicate and expand. Change over time, and our lives are spelled out in their double strands. Change over time, and we hold just one pair of each cradled in our hands. Change over time, Genes encode meaning, but not the kind that humans seek. Stories without endings or heroes, just new technique. But their tale told through us as new life appears. Spreads out over mega years. They don't think, they don't want, they don't understand. Change over time, but they urgently replicate and expand. Change over time, and our lives are spelled out in their double strands. Change over time, and we hold just one pair so briefly in our hands. Change over time. All right, so thanks to Kutztown University and my students, I've got more stuff up on my website. And, you know, I haven't been looking at the comments during all this, but I really want to hear all your ideas on anthropomorphism and what you think, because, you know, it is something that I'm really torn on. Oh, I did want to point out one more thing that I was thinking about as I was listening to talks today, which is very many people write songs about scientists, right? And that seems like an excellent way of getting a lot of the advantages about anthropomorphism, which is that people love people and people love hearing about people and thinking about people, while also, you know, eliminating the disadvantages, because of course people do have wants. And that's it. So what are your thoughts?
Hey, Rick, this is Tiffany, one of your co-hosts. And as a chemistry teacher, I think this is awesome with respect to like particles and waves and things like that, where for me personally, I think I don't necessarily, I know what you're saying when you can get yourself in danger with respect to that. But to me, I think the benefits outweigh the cost by far. I think that was great. And it really, the way that you actually put those like red arrows there, really, it's different than just singing the song. Like it actually makes a really good connection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I talked about last year. Yeah, that's my quick and easy approach. You know, a lot of the things you could have done with, you know, fancy visuals or anything like that to kind of make side points, I just do with this because I'm very lazy.
No, actually, I think in many ways it actually got the point across even more so than if you were going to see an image that was associated with that. So it really hit the, like it actually made a pretty good connection in my brain about a subject I didn't know that much about. We have a couple questions here. One is from Walter. Can folks think of examples other than evolution chart where anthropomorphism or teleology leads to important errors? And then Gary says, I think anthropomorphism can serve as a purpose for example, I sing a song about the biology of the red fox from the first person perspective. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to address the question before it. And then you have one thing from Larry here. He says, and does this relate at all to writing from the point of view of someone with a misconception? Mm-hmm. So I think those are kind of interesting takes on the whole topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, like I said, I write enormous numbers of songs for you that are very high in anthropomorphism. I mean, I think much more so than most people. So I'm by no means against it. I mostly was kind of writing this and like, man, I hope people think it's okay, right? But I think that there's such strong advantages, and as Monty said, you know, I think songs want anthropomorphism, right? The way we associate with songs is in a way that has to do with narrative and anthropomorphism in a way that, you know, is an advantage of songs, right? That emotional connection that songs produce is augmented by anthropomorphism.
Yeah, definitely. And right now we have the time, if anyone's interested, if you have a question either for Rick or either for Monty or any question at all that we'll attempt to answer for you, or Greg.
Oh wait, so I can ask, so let's see, Walter asked a question, can folks think of examples other than the evolution chart where anthropomorphism or teleology leads to important errors? And I can think of a few. I mean, one of the most obvious is, I mean, so evolution is full of these things, right? So in evolution, people often think that it's true that bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics because they sort of, it's good for them, right? And that's a teleological sort of error, right? That's not the reason that it happens. And that error sounds like, I mean, that sounds like I'm parsing finely, right? But when you're really trying to think carefully about evolution, it can be very misleading because evolution is a result of all these processes that don't have anything to do with what organisms need. And so there's a lot of issues relating to evolution.
Can I add to that quickly, Rick?
Yeah, please.
I think another case where I see this is when we're talking about molecules diffusing. Students sort of know that the oxygen is supposed to diffuse from the blood into the muscle cell and so forth, and the carbon dioxide is supposed to diffuse in the opposite direction. And so they think that the molecules are somehow, willing themselves to the proper location. So I think if we aren't careful about this, there is a really fundamental misunderstanding about how molecules move from one place to another. It's not this directed, the muscle cell needs the oxygen, so the oxygen is going to go there. It's all about, stochastic movements and gradients. And so if they anthropomorphize, then they are really misled about how diffusion works.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree. And the thing is, anthropomorphism is like a shortcut that makes students think they understand stuff when they actually don't. And that can be extra dangerous. In some cases, maybe worse than not understanding it at all. Yes, I've read The Spandrels of San Marcos, absolutely. So yes, I mean, that's the sort of concern that exists. Basically the idea is that adaptations, things that we see in organisms may not be adaptations. They may not be present for the reasons we think they are if we think strictly about everything being adaptive, right? Everything helping out the organism and having and that being its purpose, its sole purpose.
I like Monty's comment that says you could anthropomorphize the oxygen molecules as dancers in a club. This actually sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, I spent a lot of time on that concept. I don't have a song about it, but I have like a big picture of the One Direction band with like an X over them when I talk about diffusion.
Yeah, in my mind, I'm actually visualizing like in my own content, if like a sodium atom goes to a party and there's a water molecule, and they get into a Jello fight, banging heads and things like that right now. So definitely leads to a very good entertainment aspect of the content.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Jeff says also, or politicians. Yes, Jeff, I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.